Greetings, everyone. My name is Courtney Work, and I'm assistant professor in the Department of Ethnology at National Cheng Cheh University. Thanks for joining us today. And on behalf of my organizers, like my co-organizers at Michigan State University, the University of Hawaii Centers for Southeast Asia and China Studies, the East-West Center, and Chiang Mai University Regional Center for Social Science and Sustainability. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome everyone to this webinar on spirits and the spiritual life of the Mekong. We want to send a special thanks to the Luce Foundation for its support of our collaborations. And we invite anyone in the audience who'd like to know more about our work or the webinar series to reach out to us. Our webinar this morning follows the first two on the Mekong, commodities and mobilities and migration in the region. In these webinar, panelists raise questions about the interconnections between commodity chains and household livelihoods, which is deeply embedded in questions of migration and mobility and the cultural dislocations of new ways to make a living. In this panel on spirits and spiritual life on the Mekong, we will shed some light on the themes of the previous panels by connecting them to the life-giving elements of water and land, by describing the social relationships that people establish with those elements. This is often referred to as spiritual life. So we're going to disrupt some of our well-established thinking on the subject of spirits, but gently, as we examine life on the Great River, and also the surrounding mountains and streams that all contribute to its life-giving potential. Our collaborators today are Dr. Hugh Fung. She's a lecturer in Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Michigan. And she's researching the relationship between the environment and state building in Vietnam with special attention to water. Holly Hai is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Sydney, and her research examines policy and everyday life in Lao PDR. Benjamin Bowman is assistant professor at Heidelberg University's Institute of Anthropology, whose work at the Thai-Lao-Cambodian border focuses on entities of soil and water and their social lives. Andrew Johnson is a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley's Center for Southeast Asian Studies, whose two books explore the ways that entities of soil and water entangle migrants and farmers in both Bangkok and on the Mekong. Amanda Flame from Michigan State University will be fielding questions for us today. So just post them in the Q&A box as we go along, and Amanda will organize them for our discussion at the end of the panel. And now, this group of historians and anthropologists will begin by doing what they do best and tell you a story. Now, this story is designed to help you all understand life on the Mekong a little differently than you might be used to, but we will begin and end in familiar territories. Hugh will start with some history, followed by Holly, who will help you see that history from a different perspective. Benny will take you deep into the soil and water that supports this history. And Drew then will bring you back into the familiar world of migrants and dams. And after our story, we should have some time for each of the panelists to answer one broad question and have a brief discussion about some of the issues raised through the presentations. So I'm going to just let these guys do what they do best. And Dr. Fung, will you please begin?
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you for having me. To kick off our panel today, which is about the spirit and the spiritual life of the Mekong, I would like to take you to Vietnam, specifically back to the 19th century, to one of the historical moments in which that marks the marriage between the Vietnamese states and the Mekong. Now, for me, For me, every river possesses a cultural identity. In its history, the Mekong and its basins have never belonged to, one empire, not alone a state or a kingdom. Instead, as we know, so many ethnic groups have made different parts of the river region their home. So if we follow these groups and their history of how they interact with, the river, the soil, the forage in this region, the Mekong would have appeared with multiple cultural identities. So when and how the Mekong, or more exactly, the part of this, vast body of water become Vietnamese. The Vietnam have referred to the Mekong Delta as the Nine Dragon River Delta or the Kieu Long Delta. In here, two main channels of the Mekong have been referred as to Tiền Giang and Hậu Giang River, or front and back river. Now, many Vietnamese would explain to you why, this area or this delta have been referred as the Nine Dragon River Delta in a very secular way. Specifically, they would tell you that it is pretty much because of the rivers have found 9 estuaries in order to empty itself in the South China Sea. Now, here's what interesting to me. This narrative, however, is totally mixed in the historical sources. In the 19th century, in those sources that I'm quite familiar with, what we find is the back and the front river. And so much so that they even become, one of a dozen symbols that the Vietnamese states would use to represent their landscape. In particularly in the mid-1830s, the Vietnamese king at that point, Emperor Minh Mat, actually required to carve the image of the two, trainers of the Mekong rivers as the back and the front rivers in one of the 9 contours. And you might probably familiar with the fact that these kind of contours are considered very sacred in Chinese and Vietnamese cultures because it symbolizes the kingship or emperorship. Now, if from the perspective of the Vietnamese state in the 19th century, the Mekong meant the front and rear rivers, mapping this cross-border river was an important step for the Vietnamese state to, visualize that reason. Now, all of the maps that I'm showing here are quite familiar with Vietnamese scholars. And the main reason because it represents the territory, the shape of which is quite, overlap with current day Vietnam. But what people often don't talk about this is in all those maps, their representation of the entire Mekong. And you can see, for example, in this map, the largest body of water in this map is without doubt a Mekong. Now, why was the Mekong included in the map of 19th century Vietnam is very complicated questions. But what I want to say is here is that to some extent, this map is not about the question of sovereignty. Instead, it's the way for the Vietnamese states to, visualize how they connect with the frontier, the people nearby their state. So, for example, some of the place names that I just simply identify here for you. So, in a sense, it is a quarter cordial for the Vietnamese state to, visualize the land that they are part of. Now, before passing on to Dr. Hai, I'd like to know what's the story about this marriage didn't tell us. One thing is that the narratives about, the Mekong Delta and the Vietnam have been talking from the perspective of the Vietnamese expansion to the south. And moreover, in the modern time, we can see that the Night Dragons Delta is often paired with the Red River Delta. That parallelism emphasizes the identities of the Mekong as part of the Vietnamese history. However, as I just briefly shown you, in the 19th century, the Night Dragons Delta is a frontier for the Vietnamese. So when, where, how did the Mekong became part of the Vietnam is a long story to tell. And I'm gonna end here, and hopefully we're gonna continue to explore the Mekong in multi different ways. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Hugh. I'm just going to get my slides up. Okay. So in my story, I will turn our attention to the present time and go upstream the Mekong a bit to Vientiane, which is one of the cities featured on one of Hugh's maps, which is the capital of Laos. And my aim is to show you that attention to the spiritual landscapes in the Mekong can help us to rethink common concepts such as power, authority, and the state. Attention to spiritual landscapes shows that there are a variety of ways of conceiving of and relating to power in the Mekong region. So this photograph that I'm showing you now is a photograph of the city pillar of Vientiane. So this thing robed and painted gold at the back here, surrounded by all the statues, is the city pillar of Vientiane. Common legend has it that when the city of Vientiane and the state of that it was the capital of were founded, heralds announced that a sacrificial victim was required for the foundation of the new city pillar. And a woman named C heard the announcement and came forward to offer herself. She threw herself into the pit that had been dug for the great stone, and this giant stone pillar was erected over her dead body. She was pregnant at the time. Now, C is the guardian of Vientiane city. People call her the Jiao Muang of Vientiane, the master of the city. The pillar is the main site of her worship. It's now a colourful, bustling temple where people come to seek C's support in things like business ventures, conceiving a child, and travel. When I did research on the city pillar, mostly in 2018, I collected as many versions of the story about Nang Si Muang as I could. What I found was diversity. These monks sitting in front of the pillar, for instance, told me that actually in the official version of the legend, C was not pregnant at the time of her sacrifice. Instead, they said, and they said it twice in their recitation of the myth, that she recited sort of truisms about Dharma before she sacrificed herself. Yet in another shrine that's set up to, I'm getting caught by the same thing, to worship C in her supposed birth village, I heard another version of the myth where not only was C pregnant at the time, but when she sacrificed herself, the child successfully escaped from her throat and went on to live as a rice farmer, but only ever farmed one field of rice, which was then the name of one of the villages in the area, only one rice field. Oops. So in my analysis, I examine all these versions of the Nang Si Muang myth as part of a whole. I argue that even though they contradict each other, they are part of a whole, which is the stories that circulate around this city pillar. And I argue that when taken together, the Nang Si Muang myths offer a variety of ways of understanding the relationship between authority, including state authority, and the fecundity of life, pregnant bodies, the natural environment, rice fields. If the former represents power over life, then the latter represents the power of life, the power to give life. I argue that the myths turn on this contradiction between these two forms of power. The myths do not resolve this contradiction. Rather, the liveliness of the contradiction is what animates the myth and draws people to return to it again and again, offering, in so doing, each time their own version. So I make this argument in a forthcoming book called Stone Masters, which is slated for print in 2022. And this is an edited collection that features the work of a number of other scholars, including two others that are here today, Courtney and Benny. So taken together, this edited collection shows that modern states exist in a variety of relationships with the spiritual masters of the land and water. In some cases, modern states have overwhelmed local spirit practices, but in other cases, there's a kind of coexistence or even a mutual parasitism between modern states and spirit masters. And on that note, I'll hand over to Benny.
Okay, thank you, Holly. I'll try to get my presentation running too. Is it working? One moment. Now. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Holly. And I'm now will talk about termite mounds, which may be the role model of the city pillar that Holly has just shown. And this is a termite mound in a rice field in Buriram province in Thailand's lower northeast. While the Mekong forms the international border between Thailand and Laos in the northern and eastern parts of the northeast, the Dang Rek mountain range forms the international border between Thailand and Cambodia in the southern parts of the northeast. These two natural borders form the northeast not only as a geographic, but also as a social-cultural region. This is the village in Buriram province in which I conduct ethnographic fieldwork. Termite mounds are common sites in rice fields of the region. Villagers and scholars usually agree that termite mounds are essential for the fertility of fields in regions with poor soils. However, they diverge in their explanation why termite mounds increase the fertility of the soil. While scholars emphasize how termites enrich the soil with essential nutrients like nitrogen, villagers emphasize the mound's association with various spiritual beings that guarantee the soil's fertility if they are treated right. But what does right treatment mean for villagers in the lower northeast? Right treatment means here the maintenance of social relationships with the soil. These social relationships that link local subsistence farmers to the soil of their rice fields are based on the mutual participation of human in non-human existence and vice versa that is established in local spirit cults. The soil becomes a member of the social collective through these relationships, which are mediated by the spiritual beings that manifest as termite mounds, and it is reproduced in the cults dedicated to the mound. The relationships between human beings and soil that are established in spirit cults is thus not only essential to understand local conceptualizations of fertility, but more importantly, to understand local conceptualizations of sociality. As members of the social collective, the spiritual beings worshipped in these cults are usually addressed with kinship-derived honorifics, which identify them as old ones or masters of the land. The shrine we see in this picture is planted on top on an old termite mound. The mound started to grow several decades ago in a thick bamboo hedge that separates a family's plot of land from the rice fields of another villager. The family used to venerate the termite mound on a regular basis when they moved to this plot of land. Over the years, they started to neglect the mound and its spiritual master and finally forgot him completely. However, despite this negligence, the thick bamboo hedge never overgrew the mound or the shrine erected on top of it. On the picture, we see a ritual specialist's attempt to reinitiate the family's relation to the mound's master by asking him for forgiveness in a plea to accept the family's wish to re-establish the familiar cult. The family decided to renew their relationship to the soil after the ritual specialist, who is also a seer, a spirit medium, and the head of the family's ancestral cult, revealed that the ailments and financial setbacks troubling the family for a prolonged period of time were caused by the mound's master. Although naturalist common sense would classify the health ailments that troubled one of the family members as a depression and the family's financial setbacks as bad luck or inexperience in financial matters, the medium revealed that these troubles were caused by the mound's master, who was angered that the family neglected their relationship. This is another shrine in the village built around a termite mound. The woman on the picture had a very personalized relationship to the mound that grew on a plot of land that belongs to her husband's family. She is not a farmer, but runs a number of small businesses. When I met her for the first time and she showed me the termite mound, her family's financial situation was excellent. However, when I met her the last time a few years later, her financial situation has deteriorated significantly. The reason she gave for her current situation was that her sister-in-law had demanded the plot of land for herself and curtailed her access to the termite mound. She was therefore not able to maintain the cult, and so her relationship to the mound master was cut. As a consequence, the termite mound deteriorated considerably. The physical deterioration of the termite mound mirrors the woman's deteriorated financial situation, and the village women invoked this parallelism as a proof of her consubstantial connection to the mound's master. The woman had seen the master of this particular mound several times when it left the mound in form of a giant snake. Termite mounds and snakes are both regarded as deities in Hindu mythology, and their association is so close that they form an inseparable unity in Hindu-Buddhist thought. This is also true in Thailand, as this screenshot from the Thai film Ma Lila proves, where a large snake that dwells in a termite mound, here wrongly translated as an anthill, kills a girl. While the mound's master appearance resembled that of a reticulated python, the village woman assumed that it must be a naga. Nagas are snake-like non-humans portrayed in regional folklore and mythology as the original owners of the land that are also able to control the waters. They are also explicitly gendered so that the coming together of earth and water and male and female aspects in form of soil and naga in the termite mound explains why these earthly structures have such a great social significance for peasant communities in the lower northeast, and why local populations seek to establish lasting relationships with the soil through the agency of these non-human beings. And with this, I hand it over to Andrew.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm gonna talk a lot about the same region as Dr. Bauman. I'm gonna move north onto the banks of the Mekong, on the border between Thailand and Laos, but sort of staying within the Isan region, the northeastern part of Thailand, largely Lao and Cambodian-speaking part of the country, and one of the most economically disadvantaged parts of Thailand. So, if I get the first slide up. So thank you. So here, this is a stretch of the Mekong River up around the middle Mekong area, a few hours upstream from Vientiane, from Vientiane, on the Thai side looking over into the Lao side. Here, fishermen are dealing with the effects of large-scale hydropower intervention upstream with dams in China and Laos, especially the Nuozadu Dam, the Jinghong Dam, the Sayaburi Dam in Laos, dramatically altering the way the river works. The Mekong, following the closing of these dams' floodgates, drops to levels that have never been recorded before. Floods that normally bring silt and open up spawning grounds for fish do not appear, and fish catches have cratered in the time since. The new flow of the river, strangely enough, runs blue and clear, which is very beautiful, but it's lacking that silt that fortifies the river's banks, and it gives rise to large blooms of what's called tau in Lao, algae blooms that clog nets and damage ship propellers. In short, what I mean to convey is that those living along the Mekong are faced with an entirely new river. But when we say a new river, we mean much more than a new hydrology and a new ecology. Cultures and histories and ways of life, ways of dwelling are patterned around ecologies. The Naga that Dr. Bauman mentioned is also deeply associated with the Mekong River. The fishermen with whom I worked for years along the riverbanks would talk about seeing the great serpents in the flow of the water, asking it to send fish into their nets, and even telling stories about how Nagas would change into human form and sit in the backs of temples to listen to monks chanting. Even in local folklore, they would marry human women and live as a part of the community. But they don't do this anymore. And when I asked why, one fisherman replied, well, they got tired of us. So a change in the river means also a change in the Naga. Ecology and religion are more than interlinked. In the eyes of the people with whom I worked, they're the parts of the same thing. An idea of efficacy, an idea of potential that lives within the landscape. So here I want to tell you the story about a riverbank in a town behind a town that I call Banbuk, which you're seeing right here, right now. The water had been moving strangely now for years, without that flow of silt that fortifies the banks as the Mekong slowly retreats. Banks were eroding fast. And one of these banks, around a pool famous for Naga sightings, collapsed suddenly in a giant red-brown whirlpool and swirl. There was a cave there, one fisherman told me, where a Naga used to live. That erosion caused it to collapse, and that churn there is the Naga dying, trying to get out. You move to the next slide, please. But the Naga did not die. Rather, it came back. Shortly after this, a spirit medium arrived from Kanchanaburi near Bangkok, from the central region of Thailand, very far away from the Lao-speaking areas and very far away from the Mekong. He claimed to speak in the voice of what he called the Black Naga, a spirit that fishermen identified with this deceased being. Rather than serving as a link between the community and the river, as the previous sightings of the Naga had done, however, the reborn Naga presided over other concerns that villagers had: cash crops, marriage migration services, labor contracts. Rather than having a yearly ritual in which devotees gathered on the riverbank and had the medium to dance to the sound of the bamboo saxophone like traditional mediums in the region would, he consulted individual clients. In short, here was a rising out of the new changed Mekong, a new spirit, a transition that's not unique to Mekong riverbanks, but which comes as a constellation of larger changes in Thai society, one which on the Mekong, the collapse of fisheries drastically exacerbates. It shows how the river is exists in a constellation of factors: politics and infrastructure, religion and magic, lives split up by migrant work and economic reconfiguration. And as I explore, I will also pitch my book, Mekong Dreaming, just come out last year from Duke University Press. Also, these are lives interwoven with disruption, dislocation, and heartbreak. Thanks. Back to, yes.
Good. Thank you, everyone. Super interesting. There's so many connections going on here, and I love the way that that this story has kind of come together. There's a couple of themes that I want to just pull out, and there definitely is this theme of connection, right? Holly talks about the connection between the power of life and the power over life, and these really strong kinship relationships, the marriage between the Mekong and the states, and the social relationships that Benny describes in the kinship relationships with termite mounds and fertility in the region. And then Drew talks about the way that the Naga continues to connect people to their economic activities and to the activities of the state and of religion through this ongoing relationship, even through change. So these are some of the themes that I'm seeing right now. We'll have a little time for discussion afterwards, but I want to ask each of you panelists to just talk for a little bit about the kinds of changes that you're seeing right now in the region and how this affects your own work in your field site and how it affects the people that you're working with. So if we can we'll just go in the same order. I'll ask Dr. Fung to begin and answer this question. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie. So the part of my research have been on Vietnamese pre-modern archives. So instead of speaking directly about the changes in the field sites, I would like to share some of the thoughts about how pre-modern environmental historians can contribute to the studies of the spirit and spiritual life of the Mekong. So I will suggest 3 points. The first is that doing research on pre-modern environmental histories helps us break past the intellectual boundaries of the modern states. The way I approach the spirit and the spiritual life of the Mekong is first to understand the, expansion of the Vietnamese states over the course of the history, especially in the southern part of the country today, and then to trace, and here's the important point, to trace the limits of what we have associated with ethnic Vietnamese. And I believe that in doing so, we can give the room or give the voice for non-Vietnamese whose histories and cultures have so much contribution to the region. Now, the second point I would like to propose is that the study of pre-modern perception of the environment is really useful to help us find alternative ways to think about or to think beyond the conventional thought or conventional idea that we often have about human nature relationship today. So for example, one of my projects have been to write the history of the Red River in northern Vietnam. And the way I'm trying to do is, to render terminologies and cultural perception of people in the past in our today's understandings. And the process of, decoding the past is often not easy. And sometimes, it takes years to actually, if luckily we can find the answer, but at least we try. So when I try to do, to understand the history of the Red River, I couldn't find, the similar knowledge that we often easily to find, say, in geography or even political ecology today. So what I encounter in my source is totally different, war, where we really need to denote what do people mean by even a river, what do people mean by rainfall, by drought. So all of that process, all of that practices have been useful to help me to understand how the Vietnamese state conceptualize the space of the Red River. So if we are doing a similar thing for the Mekong, I think we have a lot of work to do. And it is the second point I propose. And finally, I would suggest that when we think about the sophisticated balance between development, even sustainable development, and the futures of the environment in the Mekong, we need long-term perspective. And I believe that, paleoclimate or geography or paleogeologists have done so. And I believe that history also can do so. And how, in the case of Southern Vietnam, how we can do it. The first thing we need to do is to have a more sophisticated understanding about the Vietnamese expansion over at least the last 1,000 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. Sorry, okay. Thanks for your question, Courtney, about the changes they've seen in our field sites. And I've been reflecting a lot on this lately. I've been doing research in Laos for over 20 years now. And I suppose what's really changed for me is perhaps an internal change, which is that it took me that long to start to appreciate what I was looking at when I was being an anthropologist of policy in Laos. I realized I've had a long journey to come on to realize that what I was looking at was a Lao experiment with socialism. Because when I started doing fieldwork in Laos, I know this sounds like probably really obvious to you. Probably if there's one thing you know about Laos, it's that it's a socialist country. But when I started doing my fieldwork in Laos, all of the major books about Laos use this word post-socialism. And in those books, I read that socialism had officially ended before I even arrived. And this, I'm talking about English language books here. They pinpointed this at 1986. They said this was the turning point. They claimed that in 1986, there was the introduction of a new way of thinking, which ended socialism as an economic, cultural and social platform, and that socialism was only continuing as a kind of empty rhetoric, shoring up the power of the Lao People's Revolutionary Party. So this made some things in my field site really hard to understand. Like in my first field work in the early 2000s, I didn't hear anybody talking about the new way of thinking. They used the phrases like le bot mai, the new era, but by that they meant everything since the 1975 revolution. And they did acknowledge that the end of agricultural collectives and the end of state-owned stores was a major turning point. But they pointed out that pressures to collectivise agriculture and act collectively in other ways had continued, just in different guises. So when I was doing my fieldwork in the early 2000s, the most recent pressure was for farmers to form small cooperatives, to take out joint loans, to fund very ambitious irrigation projects to make dry season rice. Now, this was disastrous locally, leaving farmers indebted and fields leached of their former fertility. And the IMF warned that investment in our irrigation was leaving Laos on the brink of insolvency with runaway inflation. But despite all of this, the push for irrigation has continued right up to the current day. And I've come to understand this not as a break with socialism, but as a continuation of the experiment in finding and founding a particularly Lao form of socialism. So I'm just going to show you do another plug. I'm really sorry, but I'm really proud of this because it's just come out recently. This is the cover for my book that's due out next month, hopefully, with University of Hawaii Press. So recent scholarship has suggested that the new way of thinking was just a relatively short-lived slogan that referred to an administrative overhaul in the 1980s. It was not analogous to Doi Moi in Vietnam or Perestroika in the USSR. In my most recent fieldwork in Gandon village in an uplands area in Laos, I've been examining socialism as a live politics of culture and culture of politics. I looked at the definition of culture in Lao policy, which is heavily informed by classic socialist literature, and also how socialism continues today on a cultural level in the language, gestures, and affective dimensions of politics. So in terms of thinking about spirits, there's a lot I could say. Maybe we can come back to that in the Q&A. But following on from Hugh's comments, I guess what I find most interesting about reappraising socialism as a live, ongoing project in Laos is to think in terms of the future. For instance, riffing off what Benny said about can we include non-humans in our concept of sociality? What if we had a socialism that included the natural resources of Laos? So I'm excited about thinking about socialism, not part of sort of Laos's dusty and irrelevant past, but part of its live present and one of the resources we can draw on for building a better future.
Okay, thank you, Holly. I will also again share my screen to show you some pictures. Yeah, the changes in my field site or in the province I do my ethnographic fieldwork in Buriram province are so tremendous in the last 10 years since I started my fieldwork exactly 10 years ago in 2011, and ever since the province has changed so rapidly that it's really hard for me to keep track of all the changes. In the past, Buriram province used to be, as Andrew also said, it is in the northeast, which is the poorest or used to be the poorest and least developed region of Thailand. And Buriram used to be the poorest and least developed province in this region. Yeah, so it was really regarded as the province of the country folk, of the country bumpkin, Ban Nok in Thailand. And there was nothing, there was no touristic infrastructure, and the only touristic highlight the province had was this, the old Khmer temple, Panom Rung, on an extinct volcano. And this is like a view of the provincial capital, Muang Buriram. As you can see, it looked rural. You can see in the back, that was the only big hotel in Buriram, which was already, it was built in the 90s, and it was already closed when I visited Buriram for the first time in 2011. And there was just one hotel when I came to the town, and that was the hotel that was associated with the Ratchapat University in Buriram. But there was actually no real touristic infrastructure in this province. But then in the same year, a local influential Thai politician, actually, he was banned from politics. So he decided to buy a local football club in his home province. He is from Buriram. And he bought the football club, and he had the vision of turning Buriram into the sports town and the sports province of Thailand. And he also created an international racing circuit. Here you can see a picture of this destination of speed, the international racing, the Shang arena. Here is the picture of the newly built football stadium, the Thunder Castle in Buriram. And Buriram now is a hub of national tourism. And here you can see the Songkran festivities in Buriram in 2019 attracted 500,000 people. And this changes the socio-economic structure of the entire province is changed. Here you can see like two pictures how a monument in the center of the city changed from 2011 to 2019. The whole province is in change. And this change also affects the relationship between the humans and the spiritual beings, and especially the mediumship cults and possession cults that characterize or that mediate these relationships. And in the past, for the sake of clarity, I call it the traditional mediums. Used to be postmenopausal women. Here we see two of them, who actually who did these possession rituals on behalf of local rural communities in villages. But in the last 10 years, these mediums changed, and young men are becoming mediums, and not only young men, but also trans persons are becoming mediums and are entering this segment of religiosity, of mediating the relationships between the humans and the spirits. And a large difference is that the traditional mediums, these postmenopausal women, used to be all lay practitioners, whereas these new mediums are professionals. They make their living from this professional mediation between humans and spirits. But besides, there's another phenomenon that is emerging, is that a whole proliferation of mediumship. And here we see a situation where lay spirit mediums are gathering at a temporal shrine that was established, an altar was established to Hindu deities, and all these lay mediums, they all channel a Hindu deity, and they come to these events to channel their mediums, to dance, to channel these deities, to dance for their deities. And this is also a new phenomenon that was absent in the past. And another thing that is new is that in the past, possession dance, you saw it in one of the pictures with these rice balls, it was only performed in possession rituals, but now these possession dances are commodified, and they are used to market villages as cultural villages to attract national tourists to come to these villages. So we see how these developments, these changes affect these rituals, the ritual life, and they don't replace it, they just change it, and it's also proliferating the spiritual life of the province. Okay, so I ended here.
Okay, I'll take over then, Dr. Bauman. So I don't have any slides to show, but maybe I'll try to be very evocative with hand gestures to talk about the scale of change. Many of the changes that Benny discusses in terms of the change in mediumship from a kind of a postmenopausal women channeling spirits of, let's say, particular islands, particular land features around the area, moving on to this sort of more abstracted, the dead Naga, the ghostly Naga, other deities and things like that are very much present in my own field site as well, which I should say is much smaller than either Vientiane or Buriram. It's a small town that has sort of a one-lane road going through. But I think what we also see are alterations. What I want to link up is that change in supernatural practice along to other changes in ecological function of the river, as well as in economic function in the village. So we get certain changes in gender. The area that I work has already been an area where women's income has become much higher than men's income. And now also women's migrant work has gotten to be much more important. Marriage migration becomes a great source of income as well. And so you get a sort of a shift in focus from fishing as a men's activity. As that gets less and less lucrative and less important, it changes some of the internal politics within the household as well. You also get, what I see, however, is that this is kind of a larger shift in alterations in sources of potential, alterations in sources of efficacy. If fishing can no longer be relied upon, then you turn towards other things. I have interlocutors who are experimenting with civet coffee, interlocutors experimenting with different kinds of cash crops, some of which are clearly scams, some of which are the introduction of agribusiness from groups like CP and things like that coming in. But a great majority of this involves informal migrant labor, mostly to Bangkok, sometimes to Taiwan, Korea, Dubai, other places like that. And so what I see is migrant labor as a kind of an alteration of this field of fishing. If you think about, if you go out, you drop your nets into the water, you don't really know what you might catch. You sort of cast it out and it drifts out of sight, and then you come back the next day and maybe you have a babook, maybe you have a gigantic Mekong catfish, maybe you have nothing, maybe you lose the net entirely. So there's this engagement with fields of uncertainty, with fields of potential and things like that, that you would then also interact with spirits of the river to help you, to help you bring yourself forth. That's also the case with the new mediums, with the new kinds of spirits, and also with the case of spirits that follow international labor circuits. In my own project, I followed a lot of migrant laborers when they come from the village where I worked down to Bangkok. And there's other spirit cults that grow up around sites of migrant labor, around trees, snakes, other sorts of unusual immersions of the natural world into Bangkok. So with international migrant labor or national migrant labor, there's an increased demand for spiritual assistance. The stakes are just so much higher. When you dip your net into the water, you engage with uncertainty, but when you marry a foreigner, when you sign a multi-year labor contract, when you go abroad and the labor recruiter takes your passport and you go to work in a Korean factory where the temperature drops to -30 in the winter, you engage with other fields of uncertainty, other fields where you need assistance. And especially for those migrant workers who kind of are lacking or searching for some sort of protection, assurance, especially in the informal economy and things like this. In this way, attachments to new spirits of the changing Mekong can be a source of protection in a sense. So that's what I see.
There you go. Great. Thanks you guys so much. This is really interesting. And I was thinking, Drew, as you were finishing up and thinking about fields of uncertainty and the way that people engage with non-human entities in kind of navigating these different fields of uncertainty. And in many ways, the entire global system is in the middle of this field of uncertainty. And I see Hugh making this really provocative suggestion that as scholars, and this, I think for historians and all of us, there's a certain translation that needs to be done to understand what happened with the secularizing knowledge production of the colonial and post-colonial eras. There is so much that's been lost through the translation of a particular lens, right? And one of the things that comes out for me in this whole discussion is the way that our explanations of the world really define the kind of relationship that we can have to it. And so we're coming now in this field of dramatic change, and it is changing the way that we have to explain the world. And I see everyone finding new tools and new ways of engaging with this kind of explanation. And so this is really exciting. I love, Holly, the idea of a new socialism that there, can we, I've thought about this a lot, right? What can we do with our community how can we understand what community is? Can it be bigger than just the people? Can our community actually be all kinds of things? Can it include the delightful pair of birds that just moved into the neighborhood? And how does this work then, and what kind of vocabulary do we use? So these are some of the things that I have. There's a lot of interesting questions that are coming from our audience, but I'd like to just take a couple minutes for you guys to talk about what insights you've had from this discussion, and see what the rest of you are thinking. So maybe anybody want to jump in and start off with this? If not, I'm just gonna point at you, Hugh, and you're gonna say something. Thanks.
Thanks, Courtney, for call me. One of the, I went, actually before I was invited into this panel, I have been really excited to learn about the Mekong. But anytime I turn to the Mekong, it is really intimidated, because it's just so much beyond that I can reach, partially because of the language barrier. And that kind of modern state, it just, ban you right away to cross the border in order to understand better. But with this panel, I started to think, we have a difficulty to reconstruct the history of this river, because we are dealing with so many different, ethnic group people. But I really like the ideas about holy myth. How about to put the non-human there? And I would add to Courtney's point about it's not just animals, but also the mountain, but also the soils. Because from my studies, the mountain, when it was named by a group, it means differently to other group. So one of the very big questions, and I hope that if someone have an answer, please share with me. And it's why it's in the long history of the Mekong, we don't have a big empire that occupy the entire region and try to impose the same policies for the entire region. But today we have so many different histories that each time a historian can tell just one segment of the history. For example, I know that one of the history about 17th and 18th century of the Mekong written by Sahite is basically the section on Laos and a little bit down to Cambodia. In northern Vietnam, in southern Vietnam, we have people who work on the colonial periods and the modern periods. But from the perspective of Vietnam, basically, we're gonna have to get back to Vietnamese scholarship in order to start to tear down. And from that scholarship, you're gonna deal with, okay, own kind of perception of the modern time, gonna filter through that. So I feel like it is a very exciting project, and it seems that it beyond one person's work. So how can we cooperate in order to, build on these projects? Thank you.
Okay, well, I can build on that a little bit, Courtney, if you like. So I think what I get from Ben and Andrew's presentation is this sense of how people in the region have relationships with the characters of places, of the water and of the soil. And that these are, just like our human relationships, quite uncertain. The Naga spirit isn't there for sure forever. It can get tired of us and go away. And from my study of socialism, one thing I've learned is that as much as there is so much to admire in Lao attempts at socialism and so much that we have to learn from them, there's one huge mistake, which is vanguardism, which is a small group of elites leading, the line of thinking, which leaves the rest of the population struggling to keep up. So in listening to Andrew and Ben and thinking about how to expand our sense of the social to include the non-human world, to think of the river as a person that we have to enter into relationships with and think how it's feeling. I would say that the warning that I know of from studying socialism is don't let it be a vanguard style approach to making these social relationships or imagining what is best. It has to be one that allows a diversity of voices and a constant renegotiation and room for grassroots innovation. That's all I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in here, and my impression is that it's basically our problem that we don't recognize non-humans as part of sociality, but to the people in the region, this is their normal life. I mean, the non-humans are part of their sociality, and it's just us who are unable to see it and unable to frame it. So we have to ask ourselves how we become able to actually understand these relationship and embody these relationship and actually become able to communicate with our interlocutors in the region on a way that actually not only we're talking with them about it, but my impression is that we still have these difficulties understanding it. And as we are the hegemonic powers still, we are imposing our conceptualizations of sociality upon these local populations and force them to interact in our economies and our politics and force them to actually neglect their relationships they have and their participation in the non-human being, and we force them to get rid of these participations to actually participate in our world, right? So we have to ask ourselves how we can become able to actually participate in their world, and this means also participating in the existence of non-humans.
Yeah, I love this line of conversation. And I really love the idea of incorporating the landscape into studies of place. I think that's something that, we can get from geography and archaeology, and there's another number of other disciplines and readings and other disciplines that talk about landscape in this way. There's even trends within anthropology, especially Andean anthropology, that looks at the role of earth beings or kind of spirits of place in political life. However, I think where Southeast Asia helps us out a little bit is again that focus on change and uncertainty and the alteration of things. And I think one push that I'd like to do, and I think is paradoxically works out, is that as we bring non-humans into our focus, we also need to keep our humanity at the center of things, because the relationships that people have with non-human beings is a very human one, is one of kinship, is one of interaction. And I think seeing the river and through the eyes of a planner, through the eyes of a dam, regulator or something like that, is seeing it through sort of Heideggerian technology, through a certain technological landscape where it has a function and it has a purpose and it has an ecology and it has all these different modes that are in there. But you're not really seeing it as a sensuous, a living thing. And I think doing long-term ethnography in the area, in the languages that are there, I think that aspect of getting to know the place and getting to know non-human actors through the eyes of the people that we work with, but getting to know non-human actors as things that come and they go and they get angry and they die and they disappear and they have conflicts with us and they fight with us and they love us. And I think that aspect, that bringing in the personal connection, may sound a little frivolous if you're a planner, but I think that's entirely the point, is because it gets at the heartbreak of losing a river. It gets at the relationship. And I think for people who have lived most of their lives in apartments, learning that intimacy with landscape is something that you have to learn. But I think ethnography is really the way to go about that. Thanks.
Nice. Great discussion. Great discussion, you guys. Thank you. So many things to think about. I'm gonna we're getting a lot of really interesting questions. And so I wanna just go ahead and jump to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. Holly, our first question is kind of directed at you, but everybody can comment on this as well. There's a new story about women and their relationship to these city pillars. And here's a story of a woman who was impregnated by an unscrupulous local teacher who ran off. You know this story, Andrew, right? And so in her despair, she throws herself into the waterfall and dies, killing both herself and the unborn child. And this place then becomes a site of veneration and worship. And so the question then is there, can you talk more about the appeal of self-sacrificing feminine characters and their relationship to the state, to religion, and other ecologies, right? And so others can comment on this too, on how this might relate to your field sites. Thanks.
Yeah, please do. If we can change like the next 30 minutes to talking about pregnancy and sacrifice in the area, I'll be really happy. But no, I know other people want to talk about other things. So, Benjamin, thank you so much. I've been trying to locate these stories in the literature and by asking people, because I do think it's been a constant presence, at least in what I've read. I work in the south of Laos, and the most famous ethnographer of that area is Ashambo, and he reports that the chronicles of the Champa kingdom just return to this question of the impregnated woman again and again and again, such that he writes, when he was doing his field work, the whole kingdom of Champasak was considered cursed by these recurring illegitimate pregnancies. And he says that was the mythical reason for so much buffalo sacrifice in the area. They said all of the women in the kingdom had to sacrifice a buffalo once a year to continually apologize for these repeated offenses. But of course, when I was doing my fieldwork, what I saw is that actually women getting pregnant was the normal way of people getting married. Like having what they call dengan, like a wedding, was completely the exception. Most of the time, a woman will get pregnant, name who their husband was, they'd have to sacrifice a pig by that stage, not a buffalo, and on they go with family life one way or another. So I'm really interested between this connection between pregnancy and territory cults and sacrifice. So if anybody has any references from where they do fieldwork, please get in touch with me, holly.hi@sydney.edu.au. And I think it's an analysis, like that kind of regional analysis is yet to be compiled and written, mainly because there hasn't been a body of scholars who are really interested in pregnancy, but hopefully we'll see that come to the fore. What else did I want to say? Sacrifice is a very difficult word to translate into local languages, and I think this word obscures more than it reveals. And maybe Courtney could say something more about that. I'll mute myself.
That's great. Thanks, Holly. I'm not going to open the box of how we need to reconsider sacrifice, but there is just one thing that sacrifice is a term that grew out of this Judeo-Christian model of giving gifts to an angry God. And what we see more often is not sacrifice, but communion. And so while rites of communion have been put under a sacrificial model, I would argue that we need to reverse that we need to understand sacrifice as gifts to an angry God under the umbrella of a basic communion. So that's my intervention on that one. Thanks, Holly. So I wonder, does anybody else have something that they want to add to this thing of fecundity? Do I see you, Drew?
Yeah, I might add something a little bit. I really love the idea of thinking through, I guess, pregnancy and potential too. I think, I mean, anybody that's spent any time in Thailand, you know the story of Nang Nak, right? This spirits that lives in an area that used to be a suburb of Bangkok, but was now taken over. And it was the spirit of a pregnant woman who died in childbirth. And now she comes back and is super famous. But she is now appropriated as an anti-military spirit because she died because her husband was gone fighting in some Thai King's Wars. But this idea about where that potential goes and what happens to that potential, I think is a really interesting thing. I believe the question was asking about a spirit in Chiang Mai, which then gets to be another kind of anti-military story as well, where it's a Bangkokian, in some tellings, it's a Bangkokian soldier who impregnates a local girl and then goes back home, and then disaster happens. So, but that's a particular retelling of the story, and the roots of it are likely much more complicated. I see this with the hands up, so I'm gonna.
Interesting, nice. Yeah, so Benny, you want to add to this one?
Yeah, just a quick. I think we all know that. I mean, these spirits that are produced by the death of a pregnant woman, right? They are regarded as especially potent. But I think the interesting question is where the special potency comes from. Yeah, I mean, the obvious reason seems to be that, okay, these are two beings that die, so these are especially potent. But I think we still, I mean, these are, I think, partly Eurocentric assumptions where this potency come from. And I'm not sure whether we really have the indigenous explanation where this potency of the pregnant woman really comes from, whether it's really just the adding up of two persons that have died, whether it has something to do with fertility or anything. I think we still lack the answer why the death of a pregnant woman generates a particularly powerful spirit afterwards.
Oh, Benny, you are right about that. That's good. There's so many places where we really need to investigate some of the assumptions that have been made about what's actually happening. So I'm excited for you to dig into that and tell us what you find. Let's go on. We have another question here from Dr. Liana Corrada, and this is directed to everyone. And she wants to know how many cultural religious sites have been lost to inundation for hydropower reservoirs in Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia. And then provocatively, how might we account for those losses? Does anybody want to pick that up? Well, I can speak just a tiny bit while you guys collect your thoughts. There's at the Lower Sesan Dam site in Cambodia, which is a tributary of the Mekong River up in the northwest. It was recently inundated, so they built the dam and then they opened the floodgates in late 2018, early 2019, and there is a place that villagers continue to talk about. There's a real disjuncture. So the village was flooded, the people were relocated, and they built another temple. And this is a Buddhist temple. So they built another Buddhist temple in the new site. But at the new site, people are quite clear about the fact that this is not the Buddhist temple. This is not really their temple. It doesn't have anything of them in it. And there are some people, the temple, I might not be remembering this story quite right, but the temple itself did not get inundated because it was up a little bit on a rise. And so people they are traveling back to the old temple to spend time there. There haven't been any big communal ceremonies, but people are still like viscerally and physically connected to this place, and they do go back to this place to reconnect themselves to their homes, is what they say.
Yeah, just following on from that, Courtney, I think what we see a lot is that while some places are lost, more commonly you see this, for instance, I work with a resettled village, and so they had a territory cult that was desecrated and apparently lost. But what you see is in a new site re-engaging with a new spirit. And so I just think we have to leave behind ideas that once a belief or a spirit master or something is lost, then that's gone, and now you have secularism. What you see, maybe the analogy with relationships with humans is in a complex, society, like, is quite apt, in that you lose touch with one friend, but then you've got these other people in your life that fill up that space. So while it's true, there is an absolute sense of loss. There's some things do end. Absolutely. I'm not arguing that there's this impervious culture, but yeah, maybe somebody else wants to jump in.
Oh, I just to continue where Dr. Hai was going. I think that's great. Yeah, because just as you lose, you can also discover, and if you're relocated, then you can have a medium sort of search out the woods and find the sites that have been buried or lost or from another time, and there you can develop a whole mythic history about a site that may or may not line up with recorded history, but has a certain kind of potential attached to it too. Not to diminish actual dislocation, dispossession, and loss, of course.
And what I think what we shouldn't forget is that, for example, the village I do fieldwork in, right, when it was founded, the people took a pillar from their original language village with them and planted it in the new village, and so they were able to establish a link to the old village in the new village. So although something was lost, right, something was also maintained. And I think we have to be flexible. But what we need to keep in mind is that if we really take seriously that people incorporate aspects of the land through these skulls as aspects of their own person, then something of this person dies. When such a site is lost, then an aspect of the person dies there, and it is also lost forever. That doesn't mean that it couldn't be filled up with something new, right? But something has died and something is lost forever. So it is both, yeah. But it is just a different conceptualization, yeah. It is not. I think we have to take really seriously how people are connected to the land and how embodied this connection to the land is and how it is mediated. And if we acknowledge this also is a powerful political tool, I think, if we want to fight dam projects or anything, if we can really prove how dislocation really affects social collectives, as the social collectives are really emplaced in the truest sense of the word.
Nice. Excellent thoughts. Thank you all very much. We've got a bunch of questions, so I'm going to just go ahead, right? So we have question 3. This is from Eric White. Hi, Eric. Are there any significant differences in the symbolism and cosmology of water and land and their interactions as one moves down the Mekong from China through Laos, Thailand, and ultimately Cambodia and Vietnam? Or are all these cultural worlds basically refractions of a shared underlying worldview? Good question. Who wants? Sorry. Does anybody want to?
Oh yeah, I was going to say, sorry, Hugh, if you wanted to jump in, but having edited Stone Masters, I feel somehow obliged to offer some kind of answer to this. So obviously it's a classic argument in Southeast Asian studies whether there's an underlying shared substratum, which is evident in connections to the land, territory, cults. Paul Mu even went so far as to say that if you added up all the territory cults, you'd end up with a cadastral survey of the area, each one with a stone at the centre. So that was in many ways our inspiration for starting the volume. But Richard O'Connor has provided an interesting attempt at a typology, saying you could think about it in 3 types. He considers people who consider themselves to have a sort of autonomous relationship to the power of the land, and then a second group who escapes my mind right now, but who grow up in relationship both to autonomous people and to the major state systems, and they have a more sort of negotiated relationship with power, where it's constantly like making contracts with the local territories, cults, and this sort of thing. And then finally, you have what he calls the athletes, the people who are into world renunciation as an access to power. And I think the other thing you see in the territory cults is some people are really interested in direct sort of relationships with the sort of power as it courses through all forms of life, and others are more mediated in that they imagine the territory cults have some kind of hierarchy with, mirroring state hierarchy. So I think these are important differences.
I'm going to keep very brief. I really can't talk for the entire Mekong region, but one of the, I want to start with a kind of a little bit funny, like an anecdote. Actually, my dissertation used to have a title of Land and Water. And when I use that title for my dissertation, I think it is very creative. But indeed, the more I learned about, other parts in southern Vietnam, the Mekong, everywhere people have the concept of land and water. So one of the things is that, yes, people who live, if we talk about the human being level, when people live on near the a large body of water like a river, chances are if we make a comparison, we might find certain kind of similarities. But one of the things I think that unique for the Mekong is that it is, we need to think about the, say, for example, some very, very key characteristics of the physical environment of the Mekong. And the downstream, the low stream, the middle section are very different. In the case of northern Vietnam with the Red River Delta, we see that the integrations between the midsection and the coast occurs very early. But in the Mekong, we see that the connection, the entire Mekong Delta is very different world compared to, say, if you just go up to a little bit above Tonle Sap, even though I'm not, an expert of that. It is one point. The second point is that there are myths about Vietnamese cultures that we talk about, on Vietnamese everywhere. There's a lot of rivers, and therefore there's kind of cultures of, water rivers that people talk about. But in this, if you just compare northern and southern Vietnam, you see two different kind of water cultures. And so even when you compare the Red River Delta and the Mekong Delta, you see two different kind of water. So I believe that there's work for us here to understand, one hand, the more over generalization of how humans, interact in waterscapes. But on the other hand, I'm, deeply seated in historical context and local context, because at the end of the day, I think human beings are very uncertain. They can react in a way that we never can be predicted. So we need to, check that change in history and see. It doesn't mean that what happened in the past is going to happen in the futures, but we want to understand that change. Thank you.
Nice, that's great. Thanks, Hugh. That is so interesting, and I love the way that what you're saying about the different characteristics of the river itself and how that really defines the way that state and local people talk about the river and the kinds of myths that emerge from the river and from this relationship. It reminds me of what Holly was talking about earlier in the way that the myth itself kind of mediates these contradictions that we see, not only in our actual experiences of life and in our experiences of the river. We kind of mediate this through the stories that we tell about it and connect ourselves that way. So nice, really interesting. So let's go on. I have a question here from Jeff Fox, and this is directed at Benny, but again, anybody can add on. He wants to know, is there any connection between termite mounds and Siva lingams? So we made the connection with the city pillars. What do you think about Siva lingams? They do look similar. What have you found? Are they connected? Is there does one precede the other?
yeah, if one precedes the other, then the termite mound precedes the Shiva Lingam, and I think Paul Mu also addressed it in his study, and he kind of indicated it that the termite mound might be the the role model for the Shiva Lingam, and I also indicated it when I say the termite mound might have been the role model for the Lak Muang and or all the Laks, Lakban, all the Laks that are known in Thai culture, right? And it's still unsettled whether the Lingam is the role model for the Lakban. And there are Indologists who actually who have worked on termite mounds and cults of anthills and termite mounds in southern India, and they also indicate that the lingam emerged as a stylized version of the termite mound in southern India or throughout the Indian subcontinent as the ritualized, stylized manifestation of a termite mound. But Holly wants to add something.
Great, thank you. I did look into this briefly for the city pillar research, and there was an interesting article by Charles Keyes, I think, comparing popular imagery of phalluses with city pillars. And he pointed out that in the area, local images of phalluses tend to be horizontal. And so you can see this, for instance, some groups erect them in their rice fields, but it's like a post that has a phallic thing coming out that way. And I also saw that in my field site, that play with phallic images was important in the territory cult, but these were horizontal. So I think that's, we have to watch out thinking that a vertical thing means phallus across.
Yeah, but the question is whether the lingam is actually a phallus, right? So we don't know whether the lingam is a phallus. It's also an interpretation, right? That people interpret the lingam as a phallus.
That is great. That is great, right? So we're going on the interpretations of what other scholars have seen, and in so many ways we can see how local representations often just get covered right over by that. Just, of course, it's standing up in straight and it must be a phallus. But no, in fact, it's not. It's a termite mound. But like, that's great. Okay, let's go on to question 5. Oh, wait a minute. So we have this issue of the planned and then now under construction Lower Mekong Dam. So as anthropologists and historians who document the multiplicity of connections between people, water, land, and non-human worlds, what kinds of cultural and spiritual dislocations should we anticipate from this dam?
I suppose I'll take that question because I didn't contribute to the phallic discussion as well. But what could you ask that again? I missed which dam are we speaking of? The Lower Mekong.
Yes.
I'm sorry. What was the and then what was
the Lower Mekong Dam, and the question is what kinds of cultural, spiritual, and ecological dislocations should we anticipate from this dam?
I mean, all I think is kind of the answer for a lot of these things. And I think the one thing is, look, I think the key thing when we talk about dislocation and disruption, and I see Dr. Corridor here has also followed up on the question about the loss of sites and the tragedy that comes with it. I think one thing that I think Benny was trying to emphasize here as well too is that the loss of a religious site is like a death. It's like a death in a family. It's a death in a network. It's not like a destruction of an entire cultural system, but it's a radical change, a radical dislocation, a radical, heartbreak and a loss of a person a loss of a being that's in a network that we got in. So I think we're caught in a on an edge between two overgeneralizations. One in which, oh, people are adaptable and they make do with whatever they do. They play jazz with culture, and everything is going to be fine. And on the other hand, this is also the sort of the developer's dream, and that like everybody will be fine, just build the dam, send them off. And then on the other hand, we have, oh, if they lose, if people lose aspects of their culture, they are forever broken and gone. I think these are both sort of, especially this one, is a bit of an Orientalist trope, but we also should not discount the tragedy and heartbreak of losing sacred sites and losing sacred parts of a landscape and beings, and just losing land, losing homeland, and this is a a deep tragedy in the lives of so many people and around the world too. And I think we shouldn't downplay that. In the area around Luang Prabang, I mean, that's a tremendously significant and old and long-standing place. And I think the proliferation of dams up and down that part of the Mekong to not just Sayaburi, not just Luang Prabang, but Bak Jom, which is a little bit further down, is another site that's slotted for dams. There's just dams being planned all up and down. Now, just now, this is your next seminar, so I don't want to.
Looks like Andrew froze, so I'm going to just jump in here, and I hope you're okay, Drew. There's another question here that kind of connects to this, and so I'm going to ask it, jump ahead a little bit. So the panelist wants to, the questioner wants to know, this is Mingli Yong, and so how common is it for local or state authorities to politically co-opt spirits to justify or legitimize development projects that may not necessarily benefit local communities? So she gives an example when the Lao government held a ceremony during the Shayaburi Dam's groundbreaking to seek forgiveness from the river. So the question is, if this is common, how might local communities respond to these actions, and how might it change their connections to the environment or the landscape? Does anybody have a thought on that one? Okay.
Thank you. Yes, I would say it's very common. And that's because these territory cults are about authority. And so there's been a long history, I'm sure Hugh can comment on this as well, of states attempting to enhance their authority by co-opting local territory cults. And so I don't know about other countries, but the Lao state is in a, like right today, building city pillars and this sort of thing to assert that their version of authority is the local one. But there's, as you say, this doesn't displace or replace local territory cults, which often run on sort of recognizable, like there's a family resemblance, but almost completely different as well. Like the importance of blood in local territory cults is sort of completely washed out and sanitized from state versions of territory cults. So how can local people use this? Well, I think this is very much constrained by the political situation in Laos. I'm not going to recommend that any local communities get out there and start, I don't know, smearing blood on the city pillars or something. They have to work within the frameworks that they're in. But they're doing it. They are keeping this understanding of the land and the water as animated and pre-populated. It's happening. Yeah.
Nice. Excellent. Yeah, Benny, go.
Yeah, I would just like to add that we need to stop seeing the spirit cults and the spirits as passive, right? That they are entities that can be co-opted by the state, but they also benefit from being co-opted by the state, because power attracts power, right? And also the cults and the spirits themselves, they also seek power, and so they also may benefit from being co-opted by the state. So we have to see it, I think, more dynamically, yeah? And not that these spirits exist and they have agency and they seek power, and so they may benefit from from being co-opted by the state, and they may also seek to come closer to the state and to the center of power. So it's both ways, right? It's not just a one-way thing.
Nice. That's an interesting comment and an important comment that I think is easy to forget. So we're almost out of time here. We have just a couple of minutes left. And so I think that we'll go ahead and wrap it up. We missed a couple of questions. Hugh, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this last round?
Maybe just one sentence. As a person who born and raised in a cultures that actually we are not Buddhism, we not any religion. We're free to pick your belief, but one of the things hard to talk about spirit and things related to that is that when, at least in the Vietnamese perspective nowadays, when you talk about that, it loses the sacredity. It loses the sacredness. So it's very hard to talk about this. So at least it is something you have to keep in your heart. So I feel like we can talk about the state and about power manipulate that kind of spirit, but I think there's something that I would leave the room for the kind of uncertainty that here is the kind of the other world that I actually don't feel that I can fully understand. So it is something that I think when we think about spirit and spiritual life of the Mekong, it is the same. We can talk, we can try our heart to understand, but it's always there, some room for us to not be able to understand.
Nice. Thank you for that, Hugh. What a great place to end our discussion. This has been terrific, you guys. I took a whole bunch of notes. I got all kinds of ideas. So really thanks everyone for your attention, and thanks to the audience for the great questions. We're going to wrap this one up right now. And I just want to remind everybody that the next panel will take place on April 28th at 2:30 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. You have to do the gymnastics on that. And this panel is going to address the dams specifically. So Mekong dams, debates, and the politics of evidence. So please join us for that next webinar. And thanks to everyone for your participation today. And so we'll close it up now. Thanks. Bye-bye now.